To get a building LEED certified in Europe or America is a Herculean task. Imagine that task in a place like Africa where every year a city grows by 1 million people. It's irresponsible. What our concerns should be, even globally, is to reduce the construction time of buildings and to build them in a more systematized fashion.
Welcome to the Green Urbanist, podcast for urbanists fighting climate change. I'm Ross. Well, hello there. Today's episode is a conversation with James Inedu-George, an architect and the founding director of HTL Africa.
I'm James Inedu-George. I'm an architect from West Africa, specifically from Nigeria. We have a unique view on sustainability in architecture that comes from our native understanding of what architecture is that has actually not been well captured by conventional media. And we use this understanding to make buildings that are a little bit different from the norm, but at the same time perform very well for their environment.
James joined me for a conversation around what he and his practice have learned about traditional West African and particularly Nigerian architecture, which is what is local to them and where they're working and living, and how they're starting to think about applying that to their own projects as an architecture firm, as well as general urbanism principles in a way that works in the modern world that we live in. Really, really fascinating discussion. You know, a topic I know next to nothing about and was just really interested to learn from James and really just let him do most of the talking. Because of who I am and where I live, most of the guests I have on are based in Europe and a little bit from North America and Australia. But I've had very, very few, if any, people from outside of those contexts on the podcast. With a few exceptions. So I was delighted to have James on and really just give him space to just share his perspective, being African and working in Africa, about what sustainability means to him in a more local sense. And it's really just part of this overall sense that I have that, responses to the climate and biodiversity crises need to be locally led, and we can share ideas and share case studies from across the world, but ultimately, we need to be looking around at what's around us, what's worked in our history, what works in our climate and with the materials around, and really responding in that way. So really, really interesting to have James on, and I hope you learn from this and find it stimulating as well, even if you're not working in Nigeria or West Africa. I think it's just the principles are applicable, and it's just generally interesting to understand this. Before we jump into the episode, just something I wanted to reflect on, which is that somebody asked me recently, what do you do if a guest on the podcast says something you don't agree with? And I just said, I don't do anything. Happens all the time that people say things I don't necessarily agree with or don't necessarily endorse. I've had 70 plus people on the podcast as guests. It would be impossible for me to agree with everything they say. Sustainability is so complex, so multivariate, and everyone is coming at it from a different angle. And so my perspective really is just to let all these differences live together, let them sort of, live in our heads, allow ourselves to be challenged by new ideas or contrasting ideas, and just try and figure our way through it. We all need to keep learning, and I think it's really healthy to allow ourselves to be challenged. And if we decide in the end that we don't agree with someone, that's fine. We can still be friends. We can still work together and collaborate, because there's no one true answer to any of this. I think we just need to keep learning. That's not necessarily especially relevant to this episode, but just generally, if you're listening to any of the episodes of the Green Urbanist, just bear that in mind. You're going to hear a lot of differences of opinions throughout the different episodes, and that's great, because we can just keep learning from that. Cool. Okay. I haven't mentioned the newsletter in a while. A couple of you have been signing up, which is great. The Green Urbanist weekly newsletter, which does not actually come out on a weekly basis, but that's the aspiration. That's on Substack. There's a link to that in the episode description. You can sign up to that if you want to just hear more about what I'm doing and get more content on green urbanism. And if you're really enjoying the podcast and you want to support it, just share the episodes with friends, colleagues on social media. LinkedIn is where I'm most active. Feel free to tag me. And you can also make a financial contribution by donating to the podcast. You can do that via Substack, or you can do that on my website, greenurbanistpod.com. A link to that is in the episode description as well. And that just helps me pay for the running costs. And I really appreciate it. So yeah, thanks very much. Enjoy the rest of the episode. I think the first thing I wanted to ask you was about, what have you learned about traditional African architecture and urbanism that you want to start bringing into your work and sort of modern contemporary African design?
Well, I wouldn't even say contemporary African design, like global design. The thing is, we've seen that the world is suffering from this menace of global warming, which we look at as we look at from a position of from a daunting position, in the sense that the world can't seem to survive with global warming. But if you look at it quite carefully, it's problems that Africans unknowingly to themselves had solved with their traditional practices, in architecture especially, over the millennia. So our goal is to be able to kind of bring these, which I'll talk about in a short while, bring these understandings that we've had, that our ancestry has had, which we're unearthing, into mainstream technological discourse to help to at least alleviate to a certain degree global warming as a problem. For instance, we have this issue of energy and heat exchange. Now, in traditional African architecture, especially with the Hausas in northern Nigeria, and that architecture cascades over the desert areas up to North Africa. So it takes a good quarter of Africa as its canvas of operation. With the Hausas, the architecture is designed to invert the temperature of the ambient temperature. So it's cold inside when it's hot outside. Those things have been attributed to the use of mud, which is something that you see the entire world trying to catch up with. Conversely, for us, it's more of a geometrical attribute. So our thesis is, if you build house architecture in any other material, it will most likely work the same way because of the understandings of how space is planned. So the Hausas have inverted the idea of the courtyard. So the courtyard in traditional, normal architectural discourse is an extracted volume from a solid, right? So it's an inverse, a negative volume. In the Hausa's architectural language, on the other hand, the house is in the courtyard. The courtyard is not in the house. What's important in architecture is to build the courtyard, not to build the house. So they de-emphasize the prominence of the volumes that make up the house, and emphasize the volume, the negative volume of the courtyard, because very importantly, house architecture is a machine for amplifying outside living. And outside living is what helps to reduce the dependence on foreign means of cooling and lighting, etc. Especially in a place like ours, that the weather is not that bad and it's easy to live outside. So what the traditional architectural thinking that we learned in school and is being built is that a house is a container of activity, like Corbusier says a machine for living in. So your goal is to trap yourself inside that volume. Hence, you hermetically seal it, etc., and cool it as much as you can. The house has said the inverse. Your house is a canvas for living outside, a series of environments that are connected by pavilions that you spend the night in. So it amplifies the performance of the environment by virtue of its design, right? And this is kind of revolutionary in terms of how architecture is seen today. So that's one of the major things that we're trying to bring back into the lexicon of architecture. That architecture is a series of environments that in totality amplify the performance of the environment in total. So you'd see that a Hausa city would be cooler naturally than any other city. A North African city would be cooler, that's traditionally built, would be cooler than any other city. The houses perform better. The people are happier, etc., etc. So these kind of little knowledges, nuggets of knowledge that we're trying to bring into the architectural lexicon in terms of form, the use of form and construction.
That's really fascinating. And is that only existing really in historical sites now, or do people still build with it in traditional ways? Our history is is truncated. So what we are today and what we were supposed to be are kind of not on the same page. So we've been taught over time, and this is a non-architectural point, but we've been taught over time that what is African is bad, what is made by us isn't good, and our ancestry has no nuggets of wisdom that can help in the world, right? But we've seen that that's not quite the point. When the British came to Nigeria, for instance, let's even invert it. Let's assume that Nigerians went to Britain. The first thing that you do when you conquer a place is to distance the people from what they understand and recognize. When you do that, then you can put your force over the people. So while it's not a good thing, it's not something that is surprising to understand if you've read a little bit of history. So when the British came, they couldn't have understood what they were seeing. They came from a place where the best you have as communication with the outside is a balcony or a bay window. That was the best communication that you had. And those things were legislated mostly by law, right? They weren't facts. They were kind of there's a word for it. They were justifications. They weren't facts, right? But African architecture is built on facts. So justification leads you towards creating detail to make the justification as beautiful as possible. When you build facts, you build canons. So the final polishing of that form is not as important. It's that it works in a certain way and produces a certain rhythm. That's what's important. But this was the 15th century. I don't see how anybody would understand that in the 15th century. So when the British came, added with the fact that there was the fear of us as a people, right? If you add all those things together, they developed what is called tropical modernism today, that in our office we simply call an architecture of fear, right? So to deal with our environment and our spirit, they created a buffering system between us and them, between what we find interesting and good for our living and them. And it makes sense. If you have a low, long-hanging roof, for instance, to block out the sun is good for me to a certain degree. Not very good for you. It's neither here nor there, right? So you protect yourself from it. But in the same way, if you make a veranda that is a zero space between the people on the outside and you on the inside, it gives you a defensible space to run into your space if there's any trouble, right? We didn't need that. We just put a fence. Right, so it's those kind of things. So we've read history wrong because we only have one way of reading it. Your architecture wasn't good. These are the ways that architecture can be good. Your architecture wasn't good. It wasn't built to this amount of detail. Therefore, your architecture
you were savages, and we had to bring in new architecture. So that refusal of those two worlds to meet has caused a schism that has made it difficult for us as Africans to actually build what we believe is good for us. And when we do that, we have to fight our people to make them understand that these things are good for them. And I would say this as a closing to that point, that using mud to build is not one of those things. Using mud to build is simply just nostalgia. If you look at African architecture from a technological standpoint, you see that the mud is a moot point, because in places where there was no mud, they built in stone. In places where there was no stone, they built in wood. So mud is just a way of asserting something that doesn't really belong to us. Mud is not an African thing. There are mud buildings in Europe. You might call it rammed earth, whatever, but the essential tool of building in mud, for instance, in the north of Nigeria, wasn't even developed by Nigerians. It was developed by a Spaniard who brought it through the Islamic pilgrimage by virtue of Mansa Musa to us. So mud is a moot point. But today, that's what has colored, that's what seemingly want to color our cities. Everything is built in brown and shades of brown, and that's where the successful architecture is, which is a problem if you look at it from the right lens and perspective.
That's just so well said, and really appreciate that sort of historical background. I think I really do sometimes just wonder how much we lost with colonialism around the world, in not only in Africa but also the Americas and Asia, and that there's in our, as you said, in our current predicament with climate change, those are the really localized knowledge and responses that we should be drawing on, rather than a more sort of globalized, westernized perspective. So I'm really glad you're doing this work and trying to sort of bring this to light. Yeah. Can you share anything, any other sort of aspects of the architecture and urbanism?
To a certain degree, yes. For instance, there's, the first thing that you learn as an architect learning from Nigeria to practicing the world, is that what we built were mud huts. Right? Of course, it's something that's a big thing. They built those round mud huts. So two things. First things first, the round mud hut was also a symbol that we take for granted, because what is spiritual in architecture is usually more like these kind of esoteric looking spaces. But to the African mind, that round hut is a symbol of the universe. It's a very simple concept. Something is in the middle, and we surround it. So it's a very simple concept. It's not a big highfalutin concept that needs several pages. But to the Hausas, what was the house was the city block, right, that was fenced and a family would live in. When the world saw it, they said the rooms, which were those pavilions that are floating in the courtyard, those rooms, they called them architecture. And because they had no flesh, they couldn't be architecture. Therefore, it meant that the people who made it had not yet discovered architecture. But on the other hand, they had, but they just discovered another lane in the architectural discourse, right? So it's that. So we've been writing and saying that it's a house, not a compound house. It looks like a very simple distinction between things, but if you look at it critically, if the compound as designed is looked at as a house, you see that what the house has built as a city is a continuous city block, so that one house relates perfectly with the other, and instead of building spaces, they built these negative spaces so that they amplified airflow around the city. The roads were built with that same kind of knowledge, because there was this kind of filmic, because of how these pavilions were placed in this free space, there was a filmic way that people walked around and air moved around. It didn't move in straight paths, which is how air flows. So the city street was built based on that knowledge. So you would walk on a street and suddenly it bulges out and reduces the space, compresses the space, or it bulges in and expands the space and creates this mini plaza, right? So it's those kind of things. There's another very important part of that lexicon too that we didn't understand. But one of my lecturers in school, a German, he wrote a book. His name was F.W. Schwechfeger. So he wrote a book which we didn't read in school. I read after school about Hausa traditional architecture. So my second year in school, we were made to understand Hausa architecture from the basis of how the family trees grew. So I mean, people died and then other people were born and this compound house kept on growing. So it would grow and die. But he was just trying to justify the architecture. But as I've grown older and I've looked at it from a more deeper perspective and had conversations with my people, what I see is some kind of adaptive transformation, right? So the house itself is allowed to die and resurrect in new forms, right? So it's adaptive, it transforms itself in an adaptive fashion. If I died and I had a son, and that son had a son, by the time that son's son is growing, he would build over me. So I become fertilizer for him to grow, right? Which is what you're seeing in our cities today. That there's been a layer of city built by the classical people, or in our country, for instance, by the 60s and 70s that we don't use anymore. And instead of breaking that layer down, we are colonizing it and transforming it in an adaptive fashion. This thing is a way of doing architecture. It's a way of growth. It says that buildings never really die, but they're allowed to go mute for a while and resurrect themselves in new forms, right? Western architecture doesn't provide for that. It's either here or it's not. So all those kind of understandings are transforming how we see space, but most importantly, how the theoretical underpinnings of how we make form. That's most important for now. Then we can then think about the soft parts of how we actually make space. But as you see, I've talked about how we can make a city, how we can make a house, and then how we can make a room. So it's how to understand how those geometries work. And then we can then put, because all the look and feel is really just a layer over that kind of understanding.
Yeah. And there was also, I mean, stuff that was lost in Nigeria and West Africa, huge cities. I mean, I've been reading recently about Benin City, or Edo, which was, I mean, a huge, basically capital city until the British came along. Is there lessons from that as well? Is that a similar sort of urbanism that you were just speaking about?
You see, the people in Benin have kind of a different kind of urbanism, but there's a lot of similarities between. I mean, again, I'll say this disclaimer: forget the mud. The mud is a means to an end. It wasn't an end in itself, But there's a lot of similarities in how things were planned, right? If you broke down even the architecture of like the Yorubas and the Benin people, and you look at the impluvium in the center of the houses, because they're built around a courtyard, right? And that courtyard in Benin traps and collects water into a central well. That's the entire concept, which is kind of like the Romans would have done. But in the case of the Romans, it's a solidly built space. In the case of the Benin people, it's a porously built space. So while the courtyard is delineated, there's also a porosity around the courtyard that makes it a little bit less of a courtyard and more of these kind of pavilions floating in space, but in a more rectilinear fashion. So that idea of pavilions floating in space is something that runs at least the gamut of Nigeria. It's just that it's been done differently in different ways. So the Benin people have done it in a way like how we do it today, because we use this rectilinear grid to plan, right? The Hausas, on the other hand, were using a rectilinear grid. Benin had less space, so things had to be more compact. The Hausas had more space, so they could do whatever they wanted to. So again, I think, and I can be wrong here, but I think that there's a similar theory in play in the creation of traditional West African buildings, especially in Nigeria, and it's that pavilions in free space. If you remove yourself from that rigid understanding of a courtyard as an excision, and you look at the spaces as how they operate and the porosity between those spaces, you see that Hausa architecture is not much different from the architecture in Benin. The forms are different, the position is different, and I can argue also that might be an airflow problem. But again, I don't have the proof for these things, but I think that it's in that line of understanding.
Yeah. No, it's so fascinating, and I think what I'll have to do is get some images of these things and put together just a blog post so people can see a visual as they're listening to this. I think that would be really useful. So what, I suppose, sort of gathering up this understanding and maybe these lost, lessons that can be learned, how is this then informing like a different perspective on sustainability from the mainstream?
Okay, so if you put all of this together, if you did a summation of all of this, it would add to something almost like a slogan that says that a building is a citizen, right? And that every building that is built, because of the fact that it's built, it must pay a certain amount of tax to the city and to the inhabitants. That tax might be economic, it might be energy, it might be amplifying the performance of the environment, it might be any number of things. But if if a building is treated as a citizen is treated, then it's forced by virtue of its existence to be sustainable. Because part of the ways of making payments to a city is being a citizen, and that's what sustains a city. So if we look at sustainability from the position of sustaining human life in perpetuity, right? Then you see that it's a payment system. Again, they've turned it into carbon credits, etc., but it's a payment system that we today pay a bit so that the guys coming behind us can have a bed to sleep on. Like you went to a hotel and paid for somebody who was coming later, right? So if a building is a citizen, it too pays its way for being here. It's not about, I don't think it's too much about all these carbon credits and carbon reductions. Those things are quite complex and abstract. I think for me, because architecture, sustainability is not a kind of architecture, it's very important for us to say that sustainability is something that must be done in architecture, in the sense that you can't build a building without a way to make the air leave non-mechanically. It's not sensible. But we had to build buildings like that to get ourselves into the position we are today technologically. So it's the chicken and the egg argument. There was no way that we'll be able to build these cities for these millions of people, right? If we didn't build those hermetically sealed buildings in the 1920s to a couple of years ago. But those buildings are not buildings, they're machines. We must accept that and start to make humans now, right? The building is a citizen, and it must connect to the city on the scale that a citizen connects to the city. If you attribute those kind of connections to a building, then we make better cities. Sustainability stops being this thing. You know, there's a sustainable look with trees on the facade, and sustainable look and all sorts of certifications, right? To tell you that your building can breathe. But if your building can't breathe, it can't breathe. There's a level of responsibility that is needed by virtue of your being alive, that if you're doing a building, certain things, why our buildings live for 100 years at least. In England, for instance, you have buildings from the 15th century on the streets. If those buildings had solar panels and were reaping energy, then you have a street of power stations. You wouldn't need the grid. You wouldn't need to use coal in the countries that use coal, or excessive nuclear in the countries that use nuclear. Then we've killed a large part, because a building that lasts that long should be a power station. It should pay its way. It should be part of the poor. It must be a good citizen. It must shake the hands of the community. That's it. For me, that's what sustainability is.
Yeah, it's not about. I mean, I think to bring it back to like a contrast with how we typically talk about sustainability, at least in I guess Europe and North America, is very much about, it's a technical exercise. First of all, there's not much philosophy or sort of spirit attached to it. It's very much about the technicalities of doing it, and it's a lot about reduction, and it's about reducing energy use, reducing materials, reducing driving, reducing flying. It's very much a process of trying to scale things back. But I think within that, we haven't really left room in the conversation for what kind of life can you live? You know, what kind of place is this? What how are people going to be healthy and happy as part of this? So it's not just I think what you're saying is it comes from a much more a place of, it's not just about you, it's about serving the wider city and the wider society in what you're building, what you're living in, which to me sounds like a pretty good starting point.
Yeah, because I don't understand why we must take away from life. Humanity has only thrived when it progresses. Once you take away progress from humanity, wars happen. Take, for instance, these water wars that are happening now, because we cannot give everybody equality and everybody can progress at the same rate. There will be immigration problems, water wars. I mean, Africans coming to Europe, it's a simple thing. It's because the rate of progress in Africa doesn't seem to match the rate of progress in Europe. If you equate the two, nobody crosses the seas. These problems they're not as difficult as we say they are. But of course there are systems that make them difficult. But realistically, I think we should look at the problems as what they are, not as these kind of complexities that we built into them. Because why shouldn't I drive a car, for instance? A car takes me to my destination faster. The idea is to make the car safer, more sustainable, and of more use to the environment. The idea is not to take away the car. Why shouldn't I take a 1 hour shower? Why? Why not? Can't we make it possible that 1 hour shower is doing something positive for the environment? Why take away the shower? Right? We found the sweet spot in humanity. We like to drive cars. We love our trains. We love to fly, right? We love to live in certain scales and sizes of houses. We love the city, right? We love to take long, hot showers. We love to socialize in parks. We love to go to nightclubs. We found the sweet spot of what humanity actually is. Why are we trying to take away from it now? I think forward, amplification, forward, progress, that's it. But how to make that progress responsible, that's where people like I come in.
So I think this, a discussion of traditional architecture, it doesn't, how do you tie that in with a sort of more modern lifestyle? And do you think there's changes in lifestyles that can be facilitated through the architecture in a positive way?
Well, no, I think there's amplifications in present lifestyles that can be created through understanding the lives of our ancestry. But I think for like the major takeaway for me from studying traditional architecture is that the buildings were underutilizing our built mass generally. Well, it takes a Herculean effort to build a city or build a building. Imagine building a bridge. And then you build that bridge, and it's just a bridge. It doesn't make any sense. We can't continue to think like that, right? You build a building, it's a high-rise building, 40 floors high. It took you 10 years to put together. Then it's just a building with a twisting facade. Who cares about that? Who cares about that? It has to be responsible. It has to fit into the things. It has to make it possible that I can take a 1 hour bath. If not, why is it there? And these things are possible. They're not difficult, they're not far away from us. Traditional architecture didn't make us live bad lives. It made people live at the top of the lives that were acceptable and accessible, at that point in time. Right? When there were horses, it allowed for horses to birth. When they could farm with hoes, it allowed for the farm to come to the house. When the toilets weren't indoor, they put the toilets in a way that it didn't smell and stink up the rest of the house. When there was no indoor kitchen, they put the kitchen in a way that, the smell of the kitchen, the good smells go in a certain way, the bad smells go in a certain way, but the fire doesn't burn down the house, right? So what we've lost is that ability to make architecture adaptable on the highest level. And instead of making adaptable, and it's the same argument with this running back to build buildings in mud. Okay, we've got a problem. Concrete is an energy guzzler. So is steel. Yeah, I understand that. So are cars, right? So now the idea is to build in mud. It doesn't make any sense. We got to concrete not by going back to Rome. We understood Rome and amplified the performance of concrete. The most important religion in humanity is progress. The day it stops, end of humanity. And that's what we're trying to accelerate ourselves towards, the way we're going. Because we're going back to the worst aspects of our tradition, not the best aspects of it.
So you say in a sense that the materials are kind of irrelevant, and that it's more the initial concept, and that is more important. So when you're sort of moving this stuff into today and trying to sort of build things with these principles, obviously you're not building with mud. made that clear. But do you think there's a role for rethinking the materials we use? Or can we sort of make use of modern materials, steel, concrete, etc., in better ways?
I think we can make use of materials in better ways. I think, look, until we got to steel and concrete, architecture wasn't democratic. Most of us would have lived and died and never ever been able to build a shack for ourselves. Right? Steel and concrete and glass liberated architecture. Why? Because they're industrialized products, and because they're industrialized, they are semi-accessible to the world. We haven't found a replacement to them. We can't keep lying to ourselves. We find all these niche materials every now and then. This net that does this kind of hemp concrete. We find a lot of stuff, but they're not on the scale of the revolution of reinforced concrete, steel and glass. We're still in that revolution. We've not been able to find any roots out of it. And I don't think it's a bad revolution. I think it's just not well used, right? I think that, of course, the usage of materials, for instance, is the forte of the architect. You want to use some kind of stone in some place that has a perfect kind of stone. Like, for instance, in Greece, you'd want to use marble, because marble is a ubiquitous material in Greece and reminds you of the ancient buildings in Greece. Oh, of course, do that. But I'm saying that it doesn't mean that now we all build all our buildings in marble. Senseless. It's senseless. Yeah. There's architecture that is specific, and there's architecture that is ubiquitous for everybody. I'm not talking about the specific architecture. You can do whatever you want, because when architecture is specific, it means that the clients want to create a certain kind of sound. So if you want to use limestone from underneath of Israel, it's fine. But the architecture of every day, the houses we live in, our schools, our churches, we have to think it as rationally as possible. And that's what we're losing out. Mud is not a rational material. You can't be using computers and driving Teslas and be living in a mud house. It's a senseless proposition.
I think also, I guess, where you're coming from, which is very different to maybe a European perspective, is how quickly Nigerian cities are urbanizing, and the incredible growth of somewhere like Lagos, where it's presumably millions of buildings every year being constructed very quickly to sort of meet this demand. And I don't know what the population statistics are like at the moment in terms of if that's leveling out or if that's still happening. But from what I've seen, you're still doing a hell of a lot of building. So it has to be systematized, and we need to find a way of like delivering that at scale in a sensible way. Yeah.
Lagos is last I read, it says 16 million. When you're in Lagos, it doesn't feel like 16 million. It's 16 that feels like 20. So there's a lot of people. It's a lot of people, and Africa is the new world. You can say whatever you want to say, but the world's going to come back, invert itself back into Africa. So Africa must be prepared for the world. I mean, it will be stupid not to prepare ourselves for the world by look, even in Europe, because I'm in Europe a lot, right? Even in Europe, people need homes. People give birth to children. People need homes, right? And not everybody can afford this kind of one-offs that we want to. I mean, we can make all those noises to get a building LEED certified in Europe or America is a Herculean task. Imagine that task in a place like Africa, where every year a city grows by 1 million people. It's irresponsible. It's irresponsible. What our concerns should be, even globally, is to reduce the construction time of buildings and to build them in a more systematized fashion. That's what our concerns should be, and cities on the city scale. Less of the one museum. An architect, a conventional architect, doesn't build a museum in his lifetime. You know what I'm saying? A conventional urban planner doesn't plan a city in his lifetime. So let's stick with the facts, right, and the numbers and the realities of it. What do we build mostly? We build houses and housing, right? Okay, let's do that at the best level we can, giving people the best quality of life they can get without stacking them together like termites, right? So these things are very important, and it's very urgent too. But I think that every generation of architects wants to make a revolution, and sometimes the revolution is going backward. So, yeah.
Can you give us a sense of what sort of form the urbanization of Nigerian cities is taking at the moment, and what a different form might look like if we learn from traditional architecture?
Okay, where there's this need in the world generally for everything to look alike. Like Singapore looks a little bit like Dubai. Dubai looks like Singapore. Singapore looks like Manhattan. Manhattan was the model. Central London is becoming Manhattanized, because when you stand at the Tate and you look over the things, it's the same, what they call it, the same skyline of Manhattan to a certain degree, right? Can't find yourself in it. So Africans are feeling left out of that. And so we're trying to westernize our cities by planning in this intense grid system, which is fine. The grid is the most important invention in architecture. It's very good. But what we are failing to do is to create a legible city network. So our cities they don't have a legible form. We've not been able to scrape and put together a legible form upon which we can then make these excessive grid-like road networks. That's the difference between traditional planning and every traditional African city that you see a map of. If you know the form of the cities, you know that this city is this place and that city is that place. So it's legible. From the palace to the market, it spreads out. Then when you add layers on top, you now make it more connected. Connectivity is important, but it's not as important as legibility. What we're losing in African cities today, trying to become like Dubai, which in itself is not a very legible city. Very beautiful, not legible, right? We're losing the ability to make a city that speaks to what we are and what we're trying to be. Lagos is never going to become the financial capital of the world. I don't think Lagos should even aspire for that. Lagos is so many things. And there's so many other spots, right, that London and New York can't fill. But it won't be the financial capital of the world. So why are we trying to make it like Manhattan? So we have to discover the form of Lagos. So I think that there's a lot that must be learned from our traditional architecture, because we've always lived in clusters, but those clusters are within other clusters. So it was intensity, reduction of intensity, another intense, almost like hamlets. So it was intense zones and locations connected by movement and greens, right? Our cities have to go back to that. But somehow we're ashamed of living like that. We want to live intensely in the highest buildings. I love to design the highest buildings, but our cities are conjoined in another way, traditionally. And until we can figure out how to conjoin our cities again, like how I've just described, we're going to struggle badly. Because the things that mean a lot to the European city planner doesn't mean a lot to the guy who lives in Lagos. The view to the sea is not an important thing in Lagos. The view from your window is not important. Right? So, but our cities are built to try and conserve the view to the sea. Conserve the view from your windows. We don't have a St. Paul's Cathedral to look onto. Nobody looks out of his windows. Most people don't stay on their balconies. They put washing in their balconies. So if you make your city based on those views, then what city are you making?
Yeah. I want to give you a chance, as we're getting to the end of the conversation. I wanted to hear a bit about your work, and if you want to highlight any projects in particular, I'd be really interested to hear, and I can point people towards it in the episode description.
Oh, okay. So we're presently creating the groundwork of what will be another type of architecture. So our work is in flux, but we're also the process of making the work is also in flux. It used to be to have a great idea or what looked like a great idea, and then everybody jumps on that idea and splits it out, and we make something out of it. But it's more collaborative now, because we're thinking deeper about the situations and trying to ensure that there's a bigger worldview, right? So our architecture is becoming more introspective than it used to be. The architecture used to be quite flashy before. It used to always have a tinge of wow, right? But it's not. It's less like that now. We're doing this 5,000-seater event and performance space, which is completing this year in Abuja, in Nigeria, right? Which is an adaptive transformation of a disused warehouse, a decommissioned warehouse that we were called to compete to. So we kind of created this engineering and wedged it from collapse, then created something that looked like a bird in flight, but that was created so that air could flow out of the center of the building. So it's being built now. It's going to be a beautiful building because the insides speak to what I was saying about Hausa traditional architecture. Is a series of different environments, right, that are marked by their ceiling designs. So some designs are curved, some have a cathedral feel, some are flat, some are wavy. They're designed to amplify the performance of that space, but at the same time to also create these individual walls that are connected by passages, etc. So again, it seems like we're putting our thoughts to practice the best we can. We're also doing a preservation in Accra right now, in Ghana, in Chibi, which is it's a 200-year-old Presbyterian church that was built by the Basil Mission when they first came to Chibi in Accra. It was the first land that the chief gave them. So they brought the windows. The wood for the windows was brought from Europe. They had wanted to use stained glass, but they couldn't do it in Accra at that time. 200 years ago is a long time, right? So the walls are built in a mixture of mud and stone. The roof was timber shingles, etc. So what we did was to study the files and kind of regenerate the work back to what it was supposed to be. First, and when we met the church, the roof was now covered in this GI zinc roofing sheets that had rusted. So we took that off, took off the old shingles, and then we, by virtue of what we had, we reignited a dying industry in Ghana that made wood shingles for roofs.
Oh, wow.
Right? We also designed the stained glass for the church, the insides and the outsides, and the windows, and also produced that stained glass with a lot of pain and struggle in Ghana. So the stained glass windows are up. So we've taken off all the old windows and doors, and now we're creating this glass pyramid, this pooled pyramid at the front of the church, where we're going to make a museum for all the kind of saints that have used the church, and all the doors and windows and all the things that were removed from the church, which we've tagged and catalogued. That's about 95% done now. That's coming upstream very soon. So, I mean, those are two projects that are dear to me now. There are other things on the board and on site that are also just as important.